Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're a show that's dedicated to uncovering the beauty of God's Word, probing big ideas in theology and philosophy, and seeking wisdom for life in our world today. My name is Ryan John Gregg, and today we're going to talk about something right in the sweet spot between curiosity about God and curiosity about science. We're actually going to talk about our brains and the way the physical structure of our brain, in particular the twofold nature of our brain into right and left hemisphere, has major impact on the way in which we know anything about ourselves, reality, and even God. And so I'm sitting here with my friend who's also my brother-in-law, Dr. Paul Long. And Paul is a physician. He's a hospitalist and is trained in internal medicine, primary care physician. And so he's somebody who's interesting to talk to about scientific ways of knowing and also faith ways of knowing. He's a Christian. And Paul and I also, we were roommates for many years in Boston. He is married to my sister, Caitlin, and the three of us were all doing our training in Boston. And so we had a house. We shared a little house for 3 years, Paul?
Yeah, it was a wonderful time. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, man.
Great, dude.
Those years were fun.
Yeah, in preparing for this, we were reflecting on some stories, and I was thinking about the beginning of the pandemic, which has a whole bunch of emotions for a lot of people. But basically, as a physician, it was a crazy time for me. And I remember getting a report from the hospital that it was going to be just really bad. It was about a week before it had sort of everyone knew that it was going to be a big deal. And so I had a wife and a baby, and we decided that she would go live with your parents. And that meant that you and I became bachelors.
Dude.
And that was quite a time.
It became primal. Like yeah. we really retrogressed.
We did. We have a whole slew of photos of us just eating, and
the beards get longer and longer.
It started, and I think we started okay. We started actually eating at the dinner table, and then I figured out that I could move the TV to my bedroom because no one's going to care now that there's like a 60-inch flat screen in my room. And then like sports was on. Remember that was when the Jordan documentary came out.
Yes.
So then basically we went from the table to just like eating mac and cheese.
I think like 100 million American men like really attached to Michael Jordan during COVID.
Yeah, that was the time. And then the other part was so we lived in this small townhouse in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it was old. So it's like the stairs are super vertical. And I think my oldest daughter was like a year old at that time. So we had to put up baby gates. But she was like long gone. And you and I were still traversing 2 baby gates, closing them. And like after like 3 weeks, I finally was like, I don't think we need to be doing this anymore. Yeah. Actually, it was 3 gates. We had one for the kitchen, one at the bottom of the stairs, one at the top. And to go from our rooms to the kitchen, you had to traverse 3 gates. And we did that gracefully for 3 weeks and then decided we didn't need to do that anymore.
It's true. Now, Paul, tell me about how I taught you to make scrambled eggs.
Yes. Yeah, Ryan's culinary skills. Actually, you should do an entire deeper episode
that is
about
a
that.
wonder. That's a good idea.
So Ryan's a wealth of knowledge, and that came. He's blessed with a brain that has that, but he also worked for that. But there was just some crazy things about the way that he would, like the intensity by which he would study, and so he didn't. I guess I'm not talking about eggs here. I want to talk about something else with cooking with you.
Oh, okay.
So he wouldn't want to like take up too much time away from like reading or like getting to class. So he had this system where he'd get one of the frozen hamburger patties and just put it on the frying pan and then cover it with a lid. And he could time it so that he would go he wouldn't flip the thing. He would just go shower, get ready, and then come down. And so like you knew, because basically the whole house is smoked out because it's just this charbroiled, like forget well done. Whatever the next thing after well done, it was that. And you just knew, like the whole house permeated with like beef smell for the next like hours.
But look how healthy and happy I am.
But you did it. You did it just fine.
It really worked out.
Got you what you needed to learn the things you needed to be here now, to bless us with your
And then
knowledge.
we moved at the same time, same summer, from Boston all the way over here.
Yeah.
And so
we failed to launch. We went out into the world. We both we both all pursued our doctoral degrees. My wife, myself, and Ryan. And then we said, well, what do we do now that we've reached the pinnacle? And we decided to go move back in with mommy and daddy. So we we went and lived there. Now we have since moved out, so we should let the viewers know that.
We all have our own domiciles.
Yes.
And yes, you don't know when I'm cooking my burgers now. I do it whenever I want.
I don't want to. I'm
Sarah,
happy.
by the way, accepts me for who I am.
That's fine. That's great. I for that time I accepted you, and I also I just appreciated everything about that time. That was a fun time.
It really was.
It was good. I was also thinking. Sorry, we're digressing into stories about our time in Cambridge, but it was a very old house. I think I already said that. But we once had a flood.
Not once.
Yeah, but the best part about this was, like, Kate had just gotten back from my wife had just gotten back from her research trip in India, and she felt really convicted about living in like a normal room for some reason. So she wanted us to move into the basement and like the basement was like a dungeon. It wasn't like
she never told me about this.
Oh yeah,
she really wanted to live in the basement.
Yeah, and it was a phase, and you try to like listen and be open minded, and but it was not going to be good, and so finally
the basement. Just so you know, the basement it was Harvard housing, and the basement was like technically unsafe for living there, according to the university, because of, I don't know, asbestos or chemicals or whatever. We couldn't live there.
There was like wires from like 1920, like hanging down.
And it was I don't know the technical term, but it was below ground and not sealed off from the outside. So whenever it rained, a serious like summer flood, it just poured into the basement. So remember rigging up that system of like a waterworks so that it would go into the pan and everything?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, I had a tin, like a little doctor's, it like looked like a doctor, the Butter Battle book where they like keep coming back with like the bigger weapon. It was like, I had like made this like tinfoil contraption, but it mattered because Ryan, like we had our valuable stuff there, but Ryan had literally made a library down there, and there was it was set up in the form of a cross, right? Like
I have my own Dewey Decimal System. But I have three main areas, and I still have this. It's in my library here. It's so there's a section that's horizontal. There's a section that's vertical, and this is conceptual. It's not like physically like this, but basically all the categories that start with H are immanent. They have to do with study of the world, anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, all that kind of stuff. That's all on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is all stuff relating to theology, transcendence, philosophy, all that kind of stuff. And then at the center, at the axis, is my Bible section, because that itself is theologically at the fulcrum of immanence and transcendence.
Yeah. I know all of that makes like perfect sense to you.
Does.
That's probably the 30th time you've explained it to me. I remember taking a book out of there once, and I was like, I don't know where this goes back. Like I was just like, so then I didn't take any more books.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a very, very fun and good time.
Well, speaking of books, we've got some books. I want to tell you about these books.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about this guy quite a bit. So Iain McGilchrist, right? I just can you basically just tell us what you know about Iain McGilchrist and just the books you've brought here?
Yep. So Iain McGilchrist, when I was in grad school, me and some of my buddies would often have this question of like, who do you think is alive today, writing and thinking today, who will actually still be read 100, 200, 300 years from now? Because at any one time, there's scores of scholars doing their thing, but very, very few of them are saying anything that stands the test of time.
Yeah.
And you only know in hindsight, but if I were a betting man, my money would be that the author in our time that will still be read significantly going forward is a guy named Iain McGilchrist. He is British, and he's a throwback in the sense that he's a polymath. He does all sorts of different things. So his areas of expertise, and I mean like high level, Oxford trained, Johns Hopkins, like highest level expertise in neuropsychology. So brain science data, how the brain works at a physical neurological level. That coupled with a sweeping comprehensive knowledge of the philosophical tradition and how people have sought after truth in different cultures through all times. And then pairing that with literary and poetic knowledge. Like he's deeply immersed in the arts as well. So he's one of these guys who's just genuinely next level. And here's the thing that's interesting for me, Paul, is like the people in my world that I know who are like thinkers I respect on both the academic side, the intellectual side, and the pastoral side are huge Iain McGilchrist fans. Mm-hmm. I texted one of my professors at Harvard about Iain McGilchrist. I was like, hey, you got to check this guy out. And now he's like a disciple. Like he just reads everything the guy's written. But I was at a pastor's conference like last week, sitting on the porch with this guy who's actually like a household name pastor, and he starts talking about Iain McGilchrist, and I'm like, seriously? And we totally nerded out about him.
Yeah.
So Iain McGilchrist he really came on the scene with this book. It's called The Master and His Emissary. We're going to talk about this. Subtitle is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. In his mind, this book is actually kind of a prologue to these two books, and this is kind of his like major opus. It's called The Matter with Things. And he's using the term matter in the sense of like materiality, but also in the sort of philosophical sense of like, why does anything matter? So what's so fascinating about him is he's not only a good writer, but he has a comprehensive view of the different ways that humans have approached the question of what it means to know anything at all. And so, yeah, he's really fascinating. But can I take you a little bit deper into?
Yeah, please. I think I'm wondering, what is it about what he's writing that sort of transcendent? It's going to exist generation after generation. You know, what is it about what he's putting out there that's going to do that?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's ultimately based in the immutable facts of neurology, and immutable. Okay, so there's natural mutations and so forth, but I think the easiest way to give you a sense of what he's all about is actually just to walk you through the table of contents of this book. So just at a high level, he starts the first, I mean, if you're into brain science, the first 230 pages are just all about brain science, the way your brain works. Turns out, so our brains have two halves, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and there's lateralization. So the right half of your brain actually controls the left half of your body, and the left half, the right half, it all crosses that way. But turns out that the two sides of the brain are asymmetrical at a structural level in small ways. There's a torque. So the alignment is not straightforward. The right hemisphere is actually a little bit larger. But more significantly, the two hemispheres have radically different modes of engaging with reality. So in very broad strokes, the right hemisphere is the part of the brain that gets the first draft of reality. It's at a neurological level, it's what's encountering whatever's out there first. And it's the part of our brain that is aware of our own bodies. So our sense of our own embodiedness is a right hemisphere thing. It is aware of things that are actually present to us. And why that matters, well, it'll matter in a second when I talk about the left hemisphere. It's the right hemisphere still, it's aware of broader contexts, so it can think in terms of multiple tiers of causality, of relation. It understands metaphor, so if you're like, my God is a rock, it can like understand that you're talking about solidity and, reliability and all that stuff. The right hemisphere can understand depth, so it's what sees in three dimensions. It's what understands narratives, the flow of story. It is the seat of emotional, relational intelligence. It has face recognition. It's also what allows us to perceive things as animate, as like living, and not even just things that are living. The right hemisphere perceives musical instruments as living. And there's, very high-end neurological testing that I don't have at the tip of my tongue to describe it, but all this stuff is deeply based in data. The left hemisphere, by contrast, it's abstracted. So if the right hemisphere is aware of the body, the left hemisphere is very dualistic, and it thinks purely in the realm of mind and divorced from the body. And it represents reality, which is to say, this is a key word, this is a key idea. It represences. So the right hemisphere is aware of presence. The left hemisphere represents or represences things. And that is why it is the seat of language in general. Like if I say the word to you, if I say the word car, now our mind, through that symbol, that word, that sound, car, has represented to our brains car.
Yeah.
But there's no car in the room to us. But language is this tool where humans systematically represent things to each other. Okay. The left hemisphere is also it's very good at analysis and bracketing everything else out except for what it's interested in. So it decontextualizes, it devitalizes. It's pretty literalistic, sort of like up or down binary. It's also it tends to be very optimistic. It thinks it can, in principle, know everything, although it's systematically wrong about how much it can know. So here's the big thing. So finishing off the first part of the book, he talks about the primacy of the right hemisphere. The way things are supposed to work neurologically is your brain, the first draft of reality is right hemisphere. Then it kicks over questions to the left hemisphere. Hey, help me understand this. Hey, what happened? What would happen if this? He frames it as a relationship between a master and an emissary. So that's the way things should work. Is starts in right hemisphere, kicks over to left, but then the final draft of reality comes back to the right hemisphere because it understands at much deeper level. But here's his key turn. The final chapter in part 1 is called The Triumph of the Left Hemisphere. And his basic idea is that the highly systematized, mechanized, analytical, technocratic mode of knowing of the left hemisphere has created civilization in its own image over the last few hundred years. So we are living in a world that is made by and for the left hemisphere's mode of knowing, which are fundamentally not as connected with reality as it is. So for him, for McGilchrist, and by the way, this is just part 1. In part 2, it's a sweeping cultural history to look at different trends in the history of thought and what type of neurology they are implicitly depending on. And so for him, the upshot is, if we don't rediscover the primacy of right hemisphere modes of knowing, then we're going to live in a world where the emissary, where the servant has usurped the master, to the great tragedy of everyone and everything.
Yeah. Do you think the Bible? So how should that influence how we approach the Bible? And sort of like something. I mean, you talked about. So he had written that the right hemisphere metaphors were, yeah. I'm just wondering about the way in which we should, engage or embrace the Bible, sort of with this in mind.
Oh yeah, I've got one of my favorite reference books on my shelf is called A Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. And in the introduction, and this was before McGilchrist was writing these things. And by the way, there's obviously been pop psychology. If you Google brain hemispheres, you're going to get, the analytical left brain is going to be all like algorithms, and the right's like fireworks and colors and all that stuff. That's sort of like pop psychology. This is 10,000 leagues deeper than that. Yeah. But here's what in that book, the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, it says the Bible is right hemisphere discourse. The Bible uses imagery. Blessed is the man who meditates on the law of the Lord. He is like a tree planted by streams of water. That little word "like," comparing this to this, and this picture of a tree. By the way, this is why Deeper Podcast has a tree as its image.
Yeah.
That can take on a life of its own in the right hemisphere. But the left hemisphere gets a little fixated on literalism. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So being a doctor, I think my referent with the brain is actually thinking about, different areas and what they're responsible for medically. But as you're talking, It's interesting. I actually just had a patient not too long ago who had a stroke.
Yes.
And actually, it's I think people can resonate with this with different injuries. If you really want to understand the value of something, you lose it, and then sort of the depth of how responsible it is and how important it is.
Yes.
So in the left hemisphere of the brain is an area called Broca's area, and so a common place to have a stroke is in a major artery that's in the left side, the left MCA. And you can have something that's called expressive aphasia, where you can understand something within, so you know it, but you can't literally express what it is. So I could hold this pen to you,
Yes,
and say, "What is this?"
Yep.
And you know it in your brain.
Yep.
But you can't. You no longer have the ability to speak it out.
Yep.
And just what you're describing here, it's the layers of knowledge and how much we are responsible for, or sort of when we receive knowledge, what we do to it in our brain.
Yes.
It goes down so many different highways, so many
Yes.
different channels, and I
Yes.
think it's important that we understand that and think about that. And I think that's what you're speaking with here is that we're receiving in, and then our brain is trying to interpret and make the best sense of this information, and it ultimately informs how we know about things or how we express certain things. I think that's very interesting, and I think it is important for us to think. And even if you're not someone who's a neuroscientist, or you don't really want to think about science too much, I think it's important to at least have some basic understanding of this, because it's important as we learn more about the Bible, or as we're on our faith journey, that you
Yes.
understand how we're filtering, how our mind is filtering this information,
Yes.
to express our faith, to live out our faith.
Yes. So a couple things. One of the things McGilchrist does a lot, because medicine deals a lot with when cells go wrong, So he talks a lot about stroke patients, schizophrenics, and the sort of pathologies of the brain as a great window into how the brain works. Mm-hmm. So when a stroke patient has a damage to the left side of the brain, they do much better after the stroke than patients who have stroke to the right side of the brain. And the patient who cannot articulate, I know what that is, but I can't say pen. That sounds like what he would describe as a left hemisphere problem, because the language thing breaks down. But I want to start bringing this towards faith a little bit, because there's a perception in broader culture that, oh, you believe in God? Well, okay. It's kind of it's not really looked at as sort of rigorous, or like what the smart kids do. The smart kids go off and they become, I don't know, whatever type of scientists or engineers or whatever. And it's sort of like, well, that's cute. You still believe in God. But Iain McGilchrist is using science to outflank that very scientific hubris, to say, actually, on the contrary, modes of knowing that are aware of God and all the types of things that religious believers use to describe God, metaphor, imagery, music, the right hemisphere is where music lives. All these types of things have a better grasp on what is real about the world than do the left hemisphere. So he's basically saying, no, the boot's on the other foot. If you want to know who's got an epistemological crut or limp here, it's actually people who live exclusively in left hemisphere land. So I want to read this passage where McGilchrist is talking about belief. So the difference between knowing something and believing something. And this indexes to left hemisphere and right hemisphere. I think for people who say that little statement, I believe in God, and we just did a couple episodes ago, we did a whole talk about what the word belief means in Hebrew, which is a whole nother fascinating conversation. It's the word amen, Hebrew. But listen to this. So this is a page and a half, and I'll pause a couple moments. He writes, believing is not to be reduced to thinking that such and such might be the case. It might be. Believing is not a weaker form of thinking laced with doubt. Sometimes we speak like this. I believe that the train leaves at 6:13, where I believe that simply means that I think, but I'm not certain that. This is so key, since the left hemisphere is concerned with what is certain, with knowledge of the facts, its version of belief is that it is the absence of certainty. If I can't be certain about something, I believe it, which is like a lower grade of knowing. This view of belief comes from the left hemisphere's disposition towards the world, its whole mode of relating. It is interested in what is useful, therefore fixed and certain. So belief for the left hemisphere is just a feeble form of knowing. So the left hemisphere is very mechanistic. It instrumentalizes things. It wants to control, to use things, and therefore it's interested in facts in a very narrow sense. He goes on, but belief in terms of the right hemisphere is different because its disposition towards the world is different. The right hemisphere does not know anything in the sense of certain knowledge. For it, belief is a matter of care. This is going to be a key contrast. The difference between right hemisphere relates to the world through care. left hemisphere through control. It is a matter of care. It describes a relationship where there is a calling and an answering, the root concept of responsibility. When you talk about having responsibility, the key word is response. I have responsibility for you. It's a relational thing. Thus, if I say that I believe in you, it does not mean that I think such and such things are the case about you, but can't be certain that I'm right. It means that I stand in a certain sort of relation of care towards you that entails me in certain kinds of ways of behaving, acting and being towards you, and entails on you the responsibility of certain ways of acting and being as well. It is an acting as if certain things were true about you that in the nature of things cannot be certain. It's not the type of thing that is open to verification in some sort of laboratory sense. It has the characteristic of right hemisphere qualities of being a betweenness, a reverberative, resonant, responsible relationship in which each party is altered by the other and by the relationship between the two. Whereas the relationship of the believer to the believed in the left hemisphere sense is inert. It's unidirectional, and it centers on control rather than care. This helps, final paragraph, he says, this helps illumine belief in God. This is not reducible to a question of a factual answer to the question, does God exist? It is having an attitude, holding a disposition towards the world, whereby that world, as it comes into being for me in my own brain, is one in which God belongs. The belief alters the world, but it also alters me. Is it true that God exists? Truth is a disposition, one of being true to someone or something. He goes on, last sentence, I'll read the last little bit. He goes, this idea of acting as if it were true, it's not a sort of cop-out. It's not an admission that really one does not believe what one pretends to believe. Quite the opposite. As Hans Weihinger understood, all knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, is no more than an acting as if certain models were for the time being true. Truth and belief are profoundly connected. It's only the left hemisphere that thinks there is certainty to be found anywhere. So what he's doing is he's saying, not only is belief a mode of knowing that is very dignified and not degraded, it's actually inescapable. Even if you say, I believe in nothing, that itself is a disposition towards the world. You cannot escape some sort of fundamental stance towards reality that creates a loop whereby you experience what you expect to experience, which only reinforces what you think you're experiencing. But he's saying the part of the brain that is richest, most supple, most caring, most loving, most in tune with the value of things is also the part of the brain that is aware of God. And as a Christian who's deeply curious in the scientific world, and this is why I'm really excited about this guy, because if you're on the pursuit of truth, at some point you have to reconcile with the fact that truth, whatever it is, goes through this organ called the brain.
Yeah.
And so if at some point you don't sit down and say, what the heck is the brain? How does this thing work in all of its multifaceted parts and then its emergent systemic qualities? You're leaving unaddressed one of the fundamental questions about what it means to know or love or, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I don't, as you're wondering, I don't think it's so much like building a protagonist and antagonist, like left and right side. It's
yes. Thank you for saying that.
Both of these serve functions.
Thank you for saying that. Yes.
And I think, but it's being aware. I think it's important to discuss this, to be aware of the potential for the brain. The brain has to receive this information, make sense of it, and then have an output, right? I mean, that's like, so if
yes,
and if we're not aware that process, I mean, I think most people would agree it's complex. I think that's understood across the board, but that there's a lot of unique elements to that create individuality, or that I think it's important that we understand that. And then,
can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you said that, because I think the way that I've been articulating it, there is a certain kind of like, you've forgotten the main thing, but the hemispheres are meant to work together.
Yeah.
And this is not about poo-pooing the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is massively important and vital, but it's about saying there needs to be balance. Interestingly, because the different sides of the brain almost have different personalities. The right side of the brain is generous and is willing to delegate and is kind of flexible.
Yeah.
The left side of the brain is kind of a control freak.
Yeah.
And so it wants to be in charge. And the right hemisphere doesn't put up a huge fight. The right hemisphere is like, okay, have it your way. So there has to be a rebalancing, and the left hemisphere has to realize that it is not the master, it's an emissary, very, very dignified and important.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad you brought up that question of balance, because I'm not trying to, create the opposite and equal problem where it's like all right hemisphere.
Yeah.
They're both necessary. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I have not. I mean, honestly, it's fascinating for me just to sit here and listen to you read that page and a half, because to think about, I've not thought about this sort of interaction in the brain this way. I mean, I've thought about there's the limbic system in the brain, which is responsible for a lot of emotion, some of our primal behaviors, reproduction.
Yep.
And what's fascinating in that system is how close our pain and aggressive systems live next to, things that, like pain live right next to joy, and how close like like that domain is, in a matter of millimeters or centimeters together. I like where things are structured in our brain and how we make sense of things is a very interesting. You said the left hemisphere is more about facts, right? About
facts construed in a certain way.
Yeah. I think for the most part in our societies, I mean, recently there's been more distrust with science, I think, with the pandemic and other things. But I think with science is about identifying facts, like that's the pursuit of, you want to test something, evaluate it to the point that you reduce probability so much so that you can now feel confident that this is a factual thing. I've discovered this thing, and it is fact. This is what it is. But how much in our recent time do you think we've pushed more as we've embraced science to the left hemisphere as you're describing it, and sort of that's what we bow down to rather than sort of also embracing the right side?
Yeah. No, I mean, encounter with what is perceived to be, and in fact is, a reduced view of the world based on a very narrow sense of facts creates a backlash, creates a reaction. And this goes back a long time. So one of the things that he talks about is how the movement of the Enlightenment, which was all about saying, hey, let's just build a whole worldview based on rigorous rationality, on what we can only like laboratory, hardcore confirm, and everything else is nonsense.
Yeah.
But there was a huge reaction against this by all the poets and free thinkers of Europe. It's called Romanticism. That basically said, no, that movement kills off everything that's good about being human, spontaneity and freedom and emotion and poetry and all this kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so he really indexes that movement and many subsequent movements to a sort of iterative struggle for the soul of civilization between the different sides of the brain.
Yeah.
And by the way, postmodernity gets to this too. It's basically one of the core impulses of postmodernity is to lash out against the hubristic, the arrogance of high modernity's sense of facts and knowledge. By the way, as a Christian, someone who's very interested in how ancient Jews thought and how they wrote, this is so very important because the ancient Jewish worldview did not emerge out of Enlightenment thinking. It emerged out of a world that looks a lot more like hieroglyphics in an Egyptian temple or something, where you've got like these figures that you're seeing from multiple angles. You'll have they're trying to show you a pool, but they'll show you the pool from like straight above and then from the side and then like from there. And it's expecting you to piece it together aspects.
Yeah.
That's why the ancient Jews wrote their narratives in kind of almost like a flash image here, and then put them all together. And then we read it as people committed implicitly to modern Western logic. And we're like, this makes no sense. This guy just can't stay on topic. Or we've really misunderstood what it even means for things to cohere.
Yeah.
And so he's getting to modes of knowing that are actually deeply resonant with ancient Jewish modes of knowing.
Yeah. This is interesting. I mean, I guess my bias here is keep putting this in through my medicine, filter. So I go, go back through it. But I think, the last century with, with science and medicine and across the board it's been fascinating. If you drew a curve, if you like through history, like say, for example, you pick life expectancy, for example, the line would be relatively flat. People we didn't extend life expectancy much between the 1200s to 1400s, maybe like a war here or there, you could see dips,
Right.
And then all of a sudden you hit the 20th century and it's like this, massive spike, right? So there's this change, and I think we and it's amazing. And I think we celebrate science, we celebrate, the facts that we've come around to understand that way. There's descriptions of seizure-like activity in the Bible, and I can now describe epilepsy in the brain and what that is about now. There's leprosy in the Bible, and now I can describe to you the same antibiotic that someone might take for acne is now, something that would treat that, and I think through that journey, even though that's amazing, we can I think sometimes we can push down the value of life because we now have control. We now understand these things.
Yes.
So it puts it in a different space. And I think we're in this very interesting juncture where we've extended life and now we're asking ourselves, well, what about quality of life? What about meaning? What about the experiences we have in a day-to-day,
right.
And this is getting more and more pressing as we interface with AI and other, sciences. What is it in our day that we, how do we process all this information that brings joy back to us? And to the extent that this overlaps with the points you're bringing, to me, it's this sense that the pendulum has swung extremely far one way as a result of success. There's been in certain metrics.
Right.
But if you focus on only certain metrics and don't step back from those and look at, if you're only focused on, the flower rather than the whole landscape, understanding, that you're going to miss a lot of who we are as humans and what it means to be human. Okay, great. I lived to 80. Well, what was the value of that? What was the experiences I had?
Yeah.
And I think about, as you brought up, left hemisphere control versus right hemisphere, more about caring.
Yeah.
And I think about that when I take care of patients. Sometimes I'll walk in a room and I'll have just spent the last 10 minutes reviewing labs, images, all this data, all this process.
Yep.
And all of a sudden I'm at the bedside of a human being and I hold their hand and there's a different feeling to this.
Yep.
A different feeling altogether. All of a sudden, it's like the flip scripts and the way you're describing, and I almost wonder if it's a left back to right, kind of experience where you, in that hand holding, in that eye to eye connection, there is an understanding that is deeper than a laboratory value, than an image value, than a diagnostic, evaluation. That just seems more transcendent. And I think we can all speak to that in our own vocations, our own family experiences. And I think maybe this is what you're delving into with this.
100%. And that word transcendent matters so much because you use the metaphor of the flower in the landscape, and the success when we're focusing in on these little questions, we're doing awesome things.
Yeah.
But our very success has prompted us to ask bigger questions. Why am I alive for 105 years, whatever. But the problem emerges when the types of questions that our success forces upon us are the very questions are invalidated or undermined by the modes of knowing that led to that success.
Yeah,
so
good.
In the background here is a pervasive materialism, the assumption that the world in which we live at bottom is just matter. It's raw matter. And of course, when you get into subatomic physics, which I pretend to understand, there's a lot more space than there is stuff, actually.
Yeah.
Things are porous. This table is more porous than it is actually substantive. But be that as it may, for a pure materialist, when you're having that encounter bedside with your patient and you're making eye contact and you've shifted now from the labs and all the data to this human being and what you feel and what they feel, what that's ultimately reducible to is, evolutionary pro-social behavior where you've been hardwired through natural selection to be deeply committed to the survival of every individual of the species. And your brain is flooding you with emotions right now that rewards that sort of pro-social altruism or whatever. I've taken whole classes on this. This is ultimately what it reduces to. So what I'm getting at is that the materialist framework does not have the resources to dignify the very questions of why does that matter? What kind of transcendence is this?
Yeah.
Is this ultimately, a sort of a Darwinian cocktail in my brain that incentivizes me to feel a certain way, and what I derive from it is radically different from what's really going on? And that's why you need a broader palette of meaning.
Yeah. And we may have to accept that we may hit an asymptote of knowledge. Like we may never,
Yeah.
since we're on the brain,
Yeah.
I think about
Wait, explain for us, for those of us who haven't taken calculus in a million years, what's an asymptote?
Like there's a place you cannot cross over. So it's like if you had like an exponential relationship, the line would get closer and closer to that line, but you would never be able to reach that line. Like we may get closer, but we may not get across that finish line of explaining this. So I think if you keep pushing in like the materialistic lens or the left, however we want to describe it here,
Yeah.
you're going to fall short eventually because it's just set up that way. The universe, like principles in the universe. I think about like a dog, for example. Like we look at like when you look at a dog that's so excited, what I see is like, man, that dog wants to talk to me so badly. Like all that dog wants to do is like talk, right? Like it's just like and just excited. But a dog's brain is never gonna let it talk.
Right. Correct.
It's never.
Correct.
And so a dog could spend the entirety of its life trying to reason, find facts, explain that. And it's going to come short. It's going to hit the asymptote that it will, like of potential, it will not be able to do that.
Right.
And I think we have to, in our same way, accept that there is limits to which we will be able to understand in our brain. And if we keep pushing, and for the sake of this, maybe in a left hemisphere, or however we want to describe it kind of way, for this pursuit of like ultimate knowledge, we may just end up going down pathways that are just a waste of we're going to it's going to be a waste of time. And probably what we're going to do is come up with false conclusions or try to piecemeal it together. Versus dog or human just like accepts reality of what it is and knowing that I cannot explain all of that. But I sure have this unique feeling in this experience or this engagement here. I don't need to explain exactly what's happening to me at the bedside when I'm holding that patient's hand, but something's happening to me. And it informs how I want to live my life. It informs how I love and care for other people. It informs how I'm going to love and care for them. And sometimes we might just need to accept that and not seek further explanation other than to celebrate things that enforce that, whether it's biblical reading or prayer that sort of feeds that a little bit more.
Well, so that's one of my favorite definitions of theology is baby talk of the language we're ultimately destined to sing. So on the idea of, okay, you have an infant's brain, their experience, they're unable to have this conversation. They just can't. But in 20 years, they can. They're ultimately destined. So all of our theology is from an infant brain. It's our babblings. It's our experimentation with the language that we're ultimately destined to speak. And we have to recognize our limitations of mind they're dignified. They're not something to despair over. But we also shouldn't pretend that there are no limits, because one of the things that he talks about is like the bureaucratization of the world, or I mean, if I can guess, the bureaucratization of the medical system that would probably want to say, Dr. Long, you only get X amount of minutes with the patient because you need to keep moving on or whatever, and you need to spend more time behind the computer looking at the labs and the readouts and doing your expertise and leave the hand-holding to grandma or something like that. The bureaucratization is based in control. It's based in the premise that, limitless paperwork, limitless language and represent, that's the way. And so
and it's not all or nothing,
correct. Yes. Thank you for underscoring that
but
again.
It does but it requires discernment,
yes.
And I think discernment through prayer, discernment through, the reasoning that, that God's allowed us to have within our brain, to be able to do that. But I think this is interesting because I think secular humanists, I think, often push for this ascension, like this, like we're going to, like we can actually ascend in knowledge to a place that like surpasses those in the past, and we'll keep. And no doubt we've been able to like understand certain, like, I mean, you think about like atrocities in the past and like lessons learned and ways we've sort of like can make sense of certain things that have informed how we ought to act in society. Like, so it's not that we're not developing or understanding, things more, I think, but to have this quest that the soul, like sole pursuit of everything is the ascension of ourselves, ascension of our
Oh,
own
dude.
brain
Yep.
is it leads to a very scary place. And I think we're seeing that, and we're seeing that.
Elon Musk's whole thing is about preserving consciousness. You know that, right? Like his whole interplanetary quest is all about like we got to preserve human consciousness, so we got to get over to Mars.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Is that like he launched a convertible, right, with a dummy in it? That's
I
like
don't know.
It's going, yeah, no, it's like a convertible, and it's got a record on. I think it's like legit, like playing music or something.
Jimi Hendrix in
like
the Far
message to
Galaxies.
the space.
Let me ask you, as we move towards close, let me ask you a piece of trivia.
I saw a hand signal here, but I don't know what that means.
It means that we've gone over our allotted time, but I don't care because this is such a great
Okay.
conversation.
All right.
Do you know the etymology, the root of the word data? Where does the word data
I don't
in
know.
the singular datum?
I don't know.
Okay. You know what I know? I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Okay. It comes from
Ryan, please do.
You know what? I'll tell you.
Okay.
It comes from the Latin word that means to give. So data, or a datum in the singular, is something that is given. And that can be used in a sort of commonplace sense of like, given that so-and-so is, this and such is the case. Or it can be used in a deeper ontological sense, a sense of philosophy, like, no, this thing is given. It comes inscribed with a relationship. It is a gift. And for me, where I land on the whole question of consciousness, because philosophers of mind, the hard question is about basically how does the material substrate of consciousness, this thing called the brain, interact with this thing called the mind. And McGilchrist is interesting because he's a total boss when it comes to like hardcore brain science, but he does not say that mind and brain are the same thing. He actually believes there's a thing called transcendence. But here's the point for me, is that the way that I think about consciousness is that consciousness itself is a gift from God. It is a gift. The very faculty of perception and awareness and judgment and discernment and creativity and all these different modes of mind, they are all together a gift-wrapped present from God, which then when you understand that, the response is that your consciousness is flooded with gratitude for the gift. And gratitude is the central Christian emotion. The whole Eucharist at the center of our faith, Eucharist means thank you. And so for me, the lens of gift and gratitude as a sort of place for this conversation to repose, for me, is a place that works for me.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll, enrich that with something else. But for the last few years, like this idea of like gift. Yeah. For God so loved the world that he gave. Yeah. Datum.
Yeah. I think it's probably a good place to land the ship, because what I'm hearing there is that you're, as we sort of pulled this, right and left, there's a control element, but when you're receiving a gift, you're not in control of that. You're accepting of that.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
And I think that is, it's okay to seek knowledge. It's okay to seek facts, but in the pursuit of control, for the sole pursuit of control, it's okay. Like data helps me have more control on how I'm going to take care of that person. So that's not by itself wrong. But if all I'm doing is just spending like hours seeking data, like for the sake of like knowing everything about that person's laboratory, like how have I actually cared for that individual or person? At the end of the day, I have to just accept that this is a human in front of me, and this is a gift, just as I'm a gift, and accept that. So anyways.
And the major flip also is, for the data conscious mind to say, you know what, actually the most important type of knowledge is not the knowledge I gain about something external to myself. It's not even the knowledge that I have of myself. It's the fact that I am known by God.
Yeah.
So it's not what I know. It's that I am known perfectly.
Yeah.
I'll never know things perfectly, but I'm perfectly known.
Yeah, that's good.
And that for me was when I really like internalized that was a huge turning point in my whole existence. So
that's good, man.
Dude, we should do this again. This was a great conversation.
Awesome. I thought we were gonna pound there, but
we should. All right, let's pound. Brothers got to pound.
Bros.
All right, man. Well, thank you for this.
I appreciate it.
And dude, love you. Thankful for you. Yeah. Grateful that there are physicians in the world like you.
We should say this is the first podcast in our new venue, right?
We should. Yeah, we're here in our new studio here at the Bay Church, and we're gonna continue to gussy it up a little bit. But a lot of huge work has been put into it. A huge shout out to Destiny Kennedy, Larry Daugherty, Dustin Smith, Cody Monzer, Cody Schneider, Candace Gilmore, Lindsay Smith. The list goes on.
We've got now you got to remember all the names.
That's all right. My left hemisphere is totally intact. I can do that. But no, truly, really, really grateful for the amazing team here. And so, guys, I should also say, Deeper is a ministry of the Bay Church. We're a church in the California Bay Area. We'd love to see you sometime, either at our online services or here in person. You go to thebay.church and you'll find out about it. And with that, I'll just leave you with the ancient rabbinic salutation of Shalomi homies. Bye-bye now.